So we have one more topic we want to address that relates to supply and demand. And that is the role that government policies play in altering private market outcomes. So remember, the point where supply and demand meet is our market outcome. And so we want to look at the ways that government can interfere with that. And there's two primary categories of government policies that do this. The first is price controls, which consists of price ceilings and price floors. And the second is taxes. And in this lecture, we're going to look at price controls. So first, let's look at price ceilings. So a price ceiling is a legal maximum on the price of a good or service. So intuitively, it's a ceiling because it's above the market equilibrium, and so you can't go above it. And an example of that is rent controls. So as always, we look at everything graphically. So here's our supply and demand for the rental market. And our equilibrium, price and quantity, can be found by looking at where supply and demand intersect. Let's say this is 300 and the price is $800 per month in rent. And again, these values are the market equilibrium, absent any kind of government policy. So let's say the government wants to place a price ceiling in this market. Let's say they place it at $1,000. So the question is, will this do anything? And your intuition should tell you that no, it won't do anything because the market price is below this. So if the government says you can't charge more than $1,000 per month in rent, but the market equilibrium is only 800, then that price ceiling is not really going to change anything. So in this situation, we say that the price ceiling is not binding, which just means it has no effect on the market outcome. So on the other hand, let's say the price ceiling is instead set at $600. Well, this does have effect on the market outcome because the market wants the price to be $800, but the price ceiling is set at $600, right? So the market can't get above that 600 value. And so in this case, we say that the price ceiling is binding. And again, that just means that it does affect the market outcome. And to see the effect it has, we can look at the implications for quantity supplied and quantity demanded. And so remember, we take our price and we go till we hit the supply or demand curve and then go down to the x-axis. So in the case of supply, we're supplying this much. Let's say it's about 250. And in the case of demand, we're demanding about 350. And so demand is higher than supply, which means we have a shortage of this amount, specifically of 100 units. And so that's the first important result here, is that binding price ceilings lead to shortages. And shortages have a couple implications. The first is that, remember, quantity demanded is greater than quantity supplied. And so that means that sellers must ration goods. Everyone who wants an apartment is not going to get one because of the shortage. And so there's a couple ways you can ration goods. One, you could just have long lines, which is somewhat inefficient. Nobody wants to wait in a long line. But perhaps worse, this could lead to discrimination based on the seller's bias. So in the case of apartments, if the seller has to ration, they might start picking people to rent their apartments that they just like better because they have many more renters than they can possibly provide apartments to. And so the problem is these mechanisms are inefficient and or unfair, and there's no guarantee that the goods are going to get allocated to the buyers who value them the most. So this highlights one of the key roles that prices play in markets. Right? It makes sure goods go to the buyers who value them the most. And prices are unbiased, which means there's no way for unfairness to enter the allocation process. So now let's look at the opposite of a price ceiling, which is a price floor. And a price floor is a legal minimum on the price of a good or service. A good example of this is a minimum wage. So let's look at what a minimum wage implies for the labor market. Let's say the equilibrium wage in the market is $5 per hour, and you have 500 people willing to work for $5 an hour. And let's set a price floor at $3 per hour. And remember, the price floor keeps the wage or the price from falling below that value. And in this case, since the equilibrium wage is $5, the price floor of $3 is non-binding. On the other hand, if we set a minimum wage above the equilibrium, we don't want the price to fall below this value. So in this case, the equilibrium wage of $5 is below that value, and so it gets raised up to the minimum wage. And so this is a binding price floor. And just like in the case of price ceilings, a binding price floor is going to have implications for the market. So in this case, we have a quantity demanded that's below the equilibrium and a quantity supplied that is above the equilibrium. And so we have a surplus of 200 workers. And another name for a surplus of workers is unemployment, right? So we have 200 workers who would like to work at the $7 per hour wage, but can't find a job. So if you recall from the very first chapter of this textbook, if you read it or looked at the notes, markets are usually a good way to organize activity. That was one of the fundamental principles of economics. And of course, we say usually here, not always. And markets usually do a good job organizing economic activity because prices are signals that guide the allocation of resources. And so messing with prices is going to mess with that allocation. So unless there is a market failure, which we'll talk about in a later module, price controls often do more harm than good. And of course, not always. So when we look at market failures, we'll see situations where price controls may be beneficial. So that's it for price controls. The next video, we'll look at taxes.